Our next student speaker is Bridget Kelly. Bridget Kelly is a first-year PhD student in sociocultural anthropology. And a fun foodie fact about Bridget is that she is in love with sour cherries, which in Eastern Europe you can eat as dumplings or as a soup. Welcome, Bridget.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. And yes, I will echo what Izzy was just saying, that how inspiring all these talks have been so far. So I have a few pictures to begin with. And in my own talk, I want to take us a bit farther afield from home, from our home, and to a corner of Transylvania, now part of Romania. So although there are big cities here, I'm gonna steer us out into the fields and the pastures and the villages like this one here. And I'm not sure what your mental image is of Eastern Europe, maybe communism or peasants or vampires in Transylvania, but it sounds to many like a place that's been left behind. Its rural areas, like those in the US too, are often imagined to be slow and empty, where there are no jobs and no young people. But after 1989, when the state socialist industries shut down, many hundreds of thousands of people set out to work elsewhere for those very same reasons. When I first arrived in the villages in northern Transylvania to talk about the effects of this migration, that story of abandonment was not all that I found. So I would like to tell you the beginning of that different story. I invite you with me into the shade between rows of corn to draw you into the abundance of life in this place, stereotyped as empty and backwards. So a part of the Austro-Hungarian border regime since the 1740s, the villages where I study have long been home to people dedicated to fighting for their right to live healthy, meaningful lives. In the 1840s, a man named Vasile Nașcu walked the 455 miles from his village, for grazing rights on the surrounding hills, challenging a feudal class system that restricted peasant livelihoods. A century later, villagers in the same space blockaded their valley, halting the advance of communist security forces, and maintained that resistance for years. When those forces finally broke through, they brought with them collectivization laws, which, as you might know, allowed the state to reclaim village farmlands for state cooperatives. Now, without their full lands, the small plot in their backyards became the last space left to them to grow their own food their own way. When neoliberal capitalism was let into Romania after 1989, many of those gardeners had to leave home to afford the skyrocketing prices of land, houses, and commercial food, now sold at grocery stores operated by Western investors. When I arrived in 2019, I heard many familiar stories about lacking public services and the collapsing industries that had pushed villagers out to work as farmhands and construction workers or truck drivers and caregivers somewhere in. Another strand of conversation ran parallel to these stories, as mothers and grandfathers loaded me down with sacks of jams and preserves and the biggest, roundest tomatoes picked that day. They asked me if I had seen their corn yet, or learned to kwasa, to thresh hay with the old scythes. They taught me about the health benefits of their produce grown without chemicals in the style great-grandma used to do, which they had learned in Austria you could call organic. And they told me about the sense of peace of being in your own garden, their favorite place at home, despite all the work that it took to maintain it, even though they were aware that at some time that kind of labor is paid elsewhere in fields where they work. But not all of the villagers want to stay. Not everyone needs to stay. But for those who do, Their garden is one of the ways they make it possible and meaningful by growing food to produce healthy families and instill pride in these ancestral practices that they have now learned to call modern. So from these stories, I want us to remember that food justice and food sovereignty are not new. They are old and deeply rooted in histories of families and communities who find sustenance in a place and fight to maintain those connections with the plants, animals, and land in their shared home. As Kisa was reminding us, this is a process. And in a world where there are many exclusionary claims to land and the very soil itself is being polluted, we must appreciate alternative efforts to build wholesome futures, like we've all been talking about today. But valuing the homegrown while keeping ancestral food practices alive provides one way people in this Transylvanian corner of the world are reclaiming their home as a fulfilling place to live. So thank you for being with me here for a moment among the corn in the village.